Hello, Pop Culture Catechism. I know it has been a while since our last episode back in June, and I know I said in June we're coming with more episodes this summer, and then it didn't happen, and I'm really sorry, but we are coming with more episodes. I'm not exactly sure when, but I'm not giving up on Pop Culture Catechism. I still love it. I'm still going to be doing more episodes, just wanted to let you know. This episode that you're going to hear today was actually recorded back in January. I've just been really busy since then, been doing a bunch of music and events and other stuff. So many apologies to Patrick Neve of the Crunch podcast, who was so gracious to do this episode with me, and then I didn't release it for like 9 months. So sorry, Patrick, but I just want to let you know that we recorded this back before we knew Trump was going to be the candidate for the Republicans, back before Joe Biden had dropped out of the race, back before we knew Kamala Harris was going to be the Democratic nominee, back before Matt Walsh had put out Am I Racist? And we talk about all those people without any knowledge that that was going to happen. So I just wanted to give you some context for when we're having this conversation, but I still think it's a really good episode. Patrick has a lot of really good things to say, so I hope you enjoy it. God bless you.
Welcome to Pop Culture Catechism, conversations about music, movies, and the longings of the human heart. Let's get started.
Who is the most informative person that you know? I would imagine it's not necessarily the person that's the most knowledgeable. I remember in high school, I had a physics teacher who was literally a NASA rocket scientist, and she was without a doubt the worst teacher I've ever had. I take that back. She's the second worst teacher. The worst one was that heretic nun that I had in grad school. But my point is, I think we can all think of people who know a lot, have a lot of information and knowledge in their heads, but they're not very good at communicating it, at getting it out to other people. And sometimes I've found the best teachers are not the smartest, not the most informative, but they're the best communicators. They can take these complex ideas and water them down just enough to help them come across more smoothly, maybe enjoyably, maybe even humorously, without losing too much of the nuance and richness, and hopefully not by losing too much of the truth of what they're communicating. Today, we're going to look at the world of infotainment, some of the best communicators in the world, and how they share and shape the information we receive. I think it's especially important to talk about this during an election year. And my guest today is someone who I've been following for a while and I've wanted to have on the show. And I think he very much kind of falls into this category of someone who communicates the truths of the faith very well and gives a good vision of kind of ordinary, everyday quests for holiness in a compelling and pleasing, enjoyable, humorous way. His name is Patrick Neve of the Crunch podcast. So if you don't know who I am, I'm Mike Tenney, Catholic speaker and worship leader from Washington, D.C. I spent over a decade teaching Catholic high school theology and also trying to make it big as a rock star. And now I am blessed to speak and lead music for thousands of people each year all over the place. And through this show, Pop Culture Catechism. This is Pop Culture Catechism. It's the gospel according to pop music and movies, where we look for God's love in the media that you're plugged into. So then when you go out in the real world and you unplug and you take out your earbuds and you put away your iPad, we can actually have a sense of the peace of the gospel and God's love in our heart, and we can share that with the people around us. So that's our goal by the end of this episode. You'll have a deeper appreciation, not only for The Daily Show and The Daily Wire and all these infotainment guys we're going to talk about, but also have some ideas for how to know God's love in your life and how to love God better and how to love other people better. I want to give a special thank you to our patrons who make this show possible through Pop Culture Catechism. I want to welcome to our show our guest today, Patrick Neve from The Crunch. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me. It's good. It's good to be here.
Yeah, good to be here too. So now I know you mostly from listening to The Crunch. If people don't know what The Crunch is, it's not immediately recognizable as like a Catholic podcast. So tell it, what's The Crunch?
The Crunch is a podcast that my buddy Ethan and I started 7 years ago when we were looking around and we didn't see any, at the time, we didn't really see any Catholic podcasts for Catholic young adults. There really wasn't much out there. And so we were like, well, we're Catholic young adults, so let's just create a podcast for our folks, right? But we didn't know each other at the time. The idea kind of came out of a Twitter conversation. The first time Ethan and I ever spoke was our very first episode. We started this podcast, and you can kind of, if you start from the very beginning, you can see a friendship develop over the course of 7 years. And so it's a really cool, a lot of podcasts are like two buddies start a podcast, but, for our show is, I like to say two podcasters became buddies,
That's interesting.
Yeah, that was like the reason we started The Crunch. And now we continue doing it because it did what it was supposed to do. It created a community of online Catholic young adults, and we're still going strong 7 years later. It's good stuff.
Yeah, I feel like you guys really have created a community, and now you have like a Discord Discord community that's doing pretty well as far as I can tell. And you've reached out.
Discord's huge.
Yeah, and you've reached out into Instagram, and
Mm-hmm.
you've been really focusing on your reels and that sort of thing. So, and I see you starting to network with some other Catholic media, for lack of a better word, like influencers and content creators.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just seems like you guys are doing really good things. You're serving a need. You're like, part of your podcast now is like dating advice, which I think
Yes.
is really interesting. And there's
It's
several
what the people
podcasts
wanted.
is what the people wanted. And I feel like there's a lot there's a few for young Catholic women, but there's not much from the perspective of younger Catholic men. So I think that's kind of cool to have that perspective as well. So yeah, I just appreciate what you guys are doing. And
Thanks.
it's similar in some ways to my story with Awaken Catholic, who is the overarching umbrella over Pop Culture Catechism and several other shows. Nick Delatorre, who founded the show, and I just kind of became friends through Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And when he was starting Awaken Catholic, invited me to be a speaker on and then run a show on the platform. And through that is where we really got to be friends in real life. Like the first time I met him in real life was I drove from DC to Ohio 8 hours to stay at his house for 4 or 5 days to record a bunch of episodes. And so our friendship, in a lot of ways, he's been on the show a handful of times, and a couple of the other hosts, John Mark Grodi, who's also a host on the network, those friendships have developed very naturally through just co-content creating. So it's very cool. So I associate very much with what you're saying. So that's very cool.
Thanks.
Let's talk about infotainment. Now, it's kind of confusing because infotainment has also come to mean like the entertainment system in cars. So if you just search infotainment, there's two meanings. Yeah, like I was searching like, what's the best infotainment on YouTube? And it came up with like, the new Honda Odyssey has a great infotainment system. So that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the definition from Wikipedia. It's also called soft news as a way to distinguish it from serious journalism or hard news. It's a type of media, usually television or online, that provides a combination of information and entertainment. So we're thinking about The Daily Show, Jon Stewart, Trevor Noah, Chelsea Handler. It's to some extent like The View, Bill Maher, Stephen Colbert. And then I feel like in more recent years, it started to be more on the conservative side with The Daily Wire. Although Rush Limbaugh going back in the day, you could say him, Glenn Beck on Fox News, maybe even not Carson Daly, Tucker Carlson. That's his name.
Well, I mean, the entire Fox News evening block is infotainment, right? It's like
Bill O'Reilly back in the day too.
People want to see those guys' opinions on the news, not necessarily just the news itself.
Yeah, and they want they're a personality. Michael Knowles, Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, those guys. So.
Yeah,
and I feel like even some extent in the Catholic world, you get kind of these bombastic personalities commenting on Catholic things. So church militant, Taylor Marshall, even Bishop Barron to some extent, Reason and Theology, maybe even us and you and I and what we're doing, talking about the faith, trying to do it in an engaging way. So anybody else you wouldn't include?
Until we started talking about this, I didn't really consider what I did to be infotainment. But the more you described it, I was like, I guess it's delivering information in an entertaining and valuable way. I would say infotainment broadly, if we're just talking about news, I think that's a very specific niche. I think that's a unique, there's a need there that people have. They want to be informed, but they don't necessarily want to be bored while they're doing it. And I think that the Catholic world has kind of embraced that style in order to deliver the faith, right? Instead of just delivering news, delivering, ideas about Catholicism. So I think like broadly speaking, infotainment would include that, but I mostly think of it as like just strictly news media, like the Jon Stewart Daily Wire folks.
Yeah. That's kind of where I focus too. You said that you feel like a lot of Catholic content creators have kind of embraced this approach a little bit. Do you think that's working? Do you think that's a good approach?
I think
like are we spreading
we're
the love of
do
God?
What? It's easy to poo-poo it, and it's easy to say like, oh, it's not, it's not highbrow. It's like, well, no, of course most people aren't, and so that's why it's important. I think it's working in that people are more biblically literate than they were before. You look at the best example, something that's extremely commercially successful was the Bible in a Year podcast. There were plenty of Bible in a Year podcasts before that. There were plenty of I'm going to read the Bible every day podcasts and books, etc. But it like 75 million downloads later, I think it was like the Father Mike Schmidt's version of that, because he is personality driven. I think personality driven content, that's really what it is. Information is secondary, I can get it from anywhere, but the personality is the entertainment piece. It's the thing that drives the content. And so I think people resonate with personalities, or there's partially a parasocial relationship going on. I feel like I know this person, but it's also a desire for connection, right? We want to know someone, we want to trust the person that's giving us information, and the best way to trust a person is by hearing jokes about their personal life and seeing their Instagram stories of them going to the park with their kids. And I feel like I trust that person more. Whereas before, there was mostly just hard news, like Walter Cronkite. You trusted him that he was on the TV, but you can't really do that anymore. Can't just trust a guy.
Yeah, there were like 3 news networks. You had like Dan Rather and Peter Jennings, and you had 3 or 4 to choose from, and they were all more or less saying the same thing. And so there was much more of a sense of this is what is happening rather than here's this spin and here's this spin, which kind of came with the 24-hour news cycle on cable news and that sort of thing. And then, of course, the internet. It's interesting what you said about trust. You feel like you trust this person, like you know this person. I feel like that's really where The Daily Show took off, was because The Daily Show started with Craig Kilburn like back in the mid-'90s, and it was a little less political. And then after just a couple of years, it switched to Jon Stewart. And that was like right when Bill Clinton was going out of office and George W. Bush was coming into office. And you had the George W. Bush, Al Gore, crazy election that it was, where they're counting the chads and everything down in Florida. You were right there. You got a front
I was not I was not very old.
I
was like 3.
Yeah,
but
I
was
elder
there.
Millennial, younger millennial here. So, but I think because those Bush years, especially those 8 years of Bush, liberals in the country, Democrats, left-leaning people in the country had this sense of like, who are these people that are voting like this? I feel alone in this country. I feel disillusioned with our country. And I feel like Jon Stewart gave them a sense of, here's somebody who gets it. Here's somebody who's speaking my concerns. Here's somebody I can trust. Even if, they were surrounded by people that thought the other way, or they just had this sense of like, who's voting this way? Nobody I know votes this way. They found in Jon Stewart somebody that they understood. Like, yes, somebody gets it. It made them feel like they belonged to something. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when the Daily Wire took off was like during the Obama years, like that was once we got 2 administrations of Obama, and then Donald Trump, who was good for business for everybody in the media, but just because of his personality. And then you get Biden. So we've had, of the last 16 years, we've had 12 of them with a Democrat in the office. So the conservative infotainment has really taken off during that time, because it had the same thing on the other side. Conservatives feel like, here's people who get me. They see this ridiculous stuff that is going on in the news, and who are these people voting for these left-wing people? But here, Ben Shapiro gets me. Michael Knowles gets me. There's this sense of trust and community that they find that maybe they're missing in their real lives. And I think that's good and that's bad. Like there's kind of a superficiality to it that kind of mimics authentic relationship and belonging. But it can give you, it can help people find each other. I mean, it's how you and I found each other to be having this conversation. So
I think that's partially why the Catholic world has embraced this infotainment genre, I think, is because the most people, I mean, I don't know this to be true. A lot of Catholics are like trying to find community in their local area, but
for sure,
a lot of folks, they have a conversion experience. They might be one of 2 people in their family, even their house, that's taking their faith seriously, let alone their school, their workplace, their neighborhood, right? They're so alone. And so when they go on whatever Catholic media, social media sphere you pick, they finally find people that they agree with. They finally find people that are saying, yeah, you're correct in your opinion, right? I think that's why the Catholic world has embraced the infotainment space, is because a lot of Catholics find themselves in the same position that you were talking about, where they feel isolated in their communities. They feel like they're the only people that believe what they believe. And so they go, does anyone else believe this? And they find someone online like me saying, hey, you're not crazy for praying the rosary, even though all of your Baptist friends are saying you are. You're actually not. And they go, wow, thank you finally for telling me that. And so that's the kind of attitude that I try to have on social media, is this is controversial to you. This is something you agree with, but it is controversial to the world. And so don't worry, you're not crazy. Like, this is true, and here's why.
Yeah. Well, I think that's important from a Catholic perspective, and you can tell me if you disagree with this or not.
I will. Don't worry.
Absolutely. So I find that one of the things I love about being Catholic is it gives me a better lens to understand the world than just like the American political polarity and whatever it's doing in the last 5 minutes. And I think there's a real temptation for Christians and Catholics specifically who tend to, if you look at our voting, tends to split pretty evenly with what the general populace of America is doing. I think there's a real temptation for us to, rather than find our identity in the teachings of the church and the community of the church, we find our ideas within kind of that political polarity within the church. So I'm a conservative Catholic. I'm a radical traditionalist Catholic. I'm a progressive Catholic. I'm a liberal Catholic. And I think this is a good examination of conscience for myself and for other people, is when my faith comes up against some something that the political party I tend to lean towards disagrees with, where do my sympathies lie? So if I tend to be more conservative and Pope Francis comes out with an encyclical about the environment, is my gut reaction like, oh, I'm kind of skeptical of this, and you're looking for stuff like I think that's a warning sign. And the same thing if if you're lean more liberal and or talking about abortion, like or homosexuality or any of the sexual things that tend to align more with conservative and the conservative side of things, are you thinking, oh, I don't know about that? Like, does that kind of make you feel not at home? Like, are we finding our belonging in the church, or are we finding our belonging in this American political polarity? And I think that's a good kind of examination of conscience for us.
Yeah, and I think a lot. Do you know the two thresholds thing? It's an Ivan Illich. I was listening to a podcast.
No, but spill the tea, man. I want to hear.
The two thresholds. Everything kind of crosses two thresholds. Anything that's good initially crosses the first threshold, where it's like, wow, this is a tool that I can use to better my life. It's like, I have a car and I can go to the job faster, right? I can spend less. I don't have to feed my horse, But then the second threshold is now the car is ubiquitous and you must use it or else, right? It's you have to drive 20 minutes everywhere. It's crossed the second threshold where now the benefits are basically gone because the means became the end. That's really what happens in this. If you cross the second threshold, is the means becomes the end. So it's the Instagram account or the Daily Wire. It's a means through which I can feel like I have a community about my ideas that I believe and wholeheartedly believe. I have people that agree with me, right? This is a means to feeling some kind of community. But the issue is when that means becomes the end. So it's like this totalizing thing where the Daily Wire is the most important thing and it must stay alive. And it's the same thing with brands of Catholicism.
Yeah,
it's this Catholic movement, whatever you want to call it, the Catholic movement of Life Team, the Catholic movement of Focus, the Catholic movement of this podcast, whatever. This is a means to preach the gospel. Okay, eventually, if it becomes the end in and of itself, this thing must survive no matter what. That becomes a problem. And so if we live in that tension in between that this is a good thing and this has become the only thing, that's where we need to stay. But it's really difficult to not cross that second threshold.
It is. And I think part of this just comes from human nature. Is there's so much fear inherent to the human experience, especially if you're like a caveman living in the woods. I think all of us live with like fear and anxiety and that sort of thing.
I live like a caveman in more ways than one.
And your beard shows it beautifully. It's a wonderful beard for those of you who are listening. I think, what was I saying? Sorry, I got distracted by your beautiful beard.
My bad. I did a joke.
It's all good.
Living out of fear, like cavemen.
Yeah. So I think so often we live out of fear, and where we find security is in other people. And there's kind of this part of human nature where we tend to divide things into an us and a them. This is the group I belong to. That's the outsider group. And that, protects us, and that's great for binding us together in families and those sorts of things. But I think because of the original sin that we're all born with and taints all of us, is that becomes twisted and corrupted and overemphasized to the point where the us and them becomes like enemy, evil, outsiders, scapegoats. Yeah. And we see this so often in the discussion between, the left. This is what they really want from you. This is what they're really all about. The infotainment, whether it's Jon Stewart or Matt Walsh or whoever, they'll often find the example of the other side behaving badly and then say, see, this is what they really want. This is who they really are. And that's the them. And you need to trust the us. And I think Jesus, a lot of his message was to break that open entirely. Yeah. No, I'm actually going to sit with the tax collectors. I'm actually going to go heal the Roman centurion's servant, even though the Roman centurion is the oppressor of our people. He broke down that the enemy is not them. The enemy is sin and the powers of darkness. And actually, we are radically bound together. And St. Paul says the same thing in 1 Corinthians. He's like, look, all you people with these charismatic gifts in the church who are speaking in tongues and stuff, like, you are not better. Like, you are like the ear, and those people over there are like the eye, and the ear needs the eye, and the eye needs the ear, and the ear needs the toe, and we're all part of this one body. And I feel like it's such a temptation in us, and it infects the church too, to say, those liberal progressive Catholics, they're the problem. Those radical traditionists, those charismatics, those whatever you want to say in the church, they're the problem. And we have the real answer. And one of my experiences I was sharing before we started, we pressed play, that I went to Catholic U for undergrad, which tends to lean more conservative. And then I went to Washington Theological Union for my master's degree, which is like pretty liberal. And both of my brothers are very involved in the Jesuits. One did JVC, one went to a Jesuit university. So I've kind of gotten to see a lot of different sides of the church. And there actually is like, even though I myself tend to lean more conservative and more traditional and charismatic in some of those ways, like I have really grown in my faith from like studying St. Ignatius Loyola and the Jesuit spirituality and like the striving for social justice. I have learned so much and grown so much in my faith from hanging out with like, quote unquote cafeteria progressive Catholics, you know what I mean? So like one of the first core members of my youth group that was like a real example to me of like a strong young man in the faith is homosexual. Right. And I agree with all of the church's teachings on theology of the body and sexuality or whatever. But I also can't deny that like him being in my church and being in my youth group and like having a relationship with me was like really beneficial for my faith. And I like learned a lot about like what it meant to be a faithful young Catholic and like a strong Catholic from him, even though he wasn't living all of the ways that I would say, well, he should be living. You know, like I've been able to learn a lot from quote unquote the other side. And I think we miss that a lot of times.
Yeah. My wife said something recently. I don't know where she got it from, but she said, God chooses your neighbors, but you choose your enemies. You know, like you choose your friends and your enemies. Yeah. God picks who you're around, but you get to pick whether they're a friend or an enemy. And I think one of the issues that these Matt Walsh and Jon Stewart type people, maybe not them specifically, I don't know them very well, but these type people can do is they can kind of trick you into thinking that because someone is XYZ, they equal an enemy. And I think that's very damaging to Catholics because, you know, Jesus said to love your enemies, but he didn't say to make enemies. He said, you know, the people that you decide that are your enemies or that they decide are your enemies, you're supposed to love them, but like you're also supposed to like not have too many. If you're making enemies everywhere you go, it's probably an issue. And so, I think
doesn't St. Paul say something like when possible, live at peace with everyone, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a really solid way to live your life, the make peace with everybody thing. I was talking yesterday with a stand-up comedian who he works blue, if you know what that means. He doesn't work clean. You work clean or you work blue.
Okay.
Blue collar, basically. Like you say dirty words and talk about sex in ways that might not be popular or appropriate for families, right? He was talking about how
not dry bar comedy.
Not dry bar comedy. One of these days he might do a dry bar, but like, he's not always dry bar. And he was talking about how that kind of career choice that he made long before he became Catholic, that has gotten him into some spaces where he's around some lapsed Catholics, you know, some very non-Catholic people. And he was telling a fascinating story about a gay man who was a former Catholic and would wear a St. Christopher medal, but when he was with his lovers, he would take off the medal out of respect because he recognized that it represented a worldview that he did not connect with. And it's like, it shows that even in people that completely reject the church, the teachings of the church, they can still have a little bit of respect and a little bit of understanding, and there's a little bit of common ground. And it's very dangerous. It's very counterproductive to completely obliterate that common ground by saying, no, you're an enemy and I refuse to speak with you until you fulfill these obligations. It's like, start from the St. Christopher medal. Don't start from the stop, you know, engaging in these activities. Start from the St. Christopher medal, you know, and then work your way to that, you know.
Something that I've noticed in my own life is, you know, so I went to college in the kind of early mid-2000s, when social media was just starting. So Facebook came out like, I think 2000, but it really didn't become interactive until a few years later. Like at first it was just basically you put up a picture, some things about yourself, but there wasn't like a wall, there wasn't like discussion in a comment box and all that. That didn't really come around to like the end of the 2000. And in college, I loved having political debates with people. I get together with friends and we disagree. And a lot of my friends were in the musical theater, like the music school at Catholic U, and that was like where all the liberals were at Catholic U. And I had a lot of friends there because I was a musician, so I was often doing stuff with them. So we'd have all these discussions, and it brought us together to have these like intense discussions, even though we very much disagreed. And we'd have these intense discussions where we disagreed, but at the end of the night, I felt closer to them because we'd like shared our hearts with one another. And then I noticed once we graduated and we're out in the world and we live in different states and we're having these discussions online in a comment box, after those discussions, I would feel like an animosity towards the person.
Oh,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
So I think it's very, very dangerous because you can kind of make up these enemies in your mind and you're having arguments with people that don't even exist. Say, the left, they're such hypocrites because they believe this and they believe this. It's like, who are you talking about? Have you had that conversation with a person, or are you just comparing one liberal's opinion versus another liberal's opinion and then pretending that that's a double standard? And that happens all the time. Like it happens the other way too. People say, oh, you pro-lifers, you care about the unborn, but you don't, but then you wanna, tax the poor and give all the money to the rich. It was like, have you heard that from a conservative person in real life? Have you had that conversation? Or you're just comparing two different conservatives on different positions and there's no context in between. It's such a straw man.
No, it's so funny. It's so funny online because people kind of reveal that they don't know someone who has these opinions because they'll say things like, oh, pro-lifers, they want to save the babies, but they don't want to adopt them. Or like, oh, you want to force women to have the baby, force the dad to stick around. It's like, yeah, those are all things that pro-lifers would agree with you on. What do you mean? Like, you don't understand. We have common ground here. Let's talk about this.
Who do you think is adopting these kids?
Yeah, no, it's true. It's so funny. It reminds me of I don't think people recognize in comment sections how much their own biases influence the tenor of the conversation as it takes place in their head. I remember when I was in high school, I used to have these conversations with this girl who went to another high school. She was always posting like pro-choice and like other kinds of things like that on Facebook, and I would respond. And this happened like a couple of times a month for a while. And then I thought these conversations were very level-headed. Of course, they got in-depth, etc. But I remember one time I saw her talking about, like, oh, don't mind him. He's like, there's a guy that yells at me on Facebook. And I realized, like, oh my gosh, the whole time she thought I was yelling at her. She thought that I was berating her. She thought that I was angry, but I was extremely calm personally. And so, we really need to be careful about how we engage with people online because we don't know how our tone is coming across. We don't know how we're being received. And then conversely, when someone comes at you, they might not actually be coming at you. They might just be saying something that you've taken the wrong way. And so I think that's another huge thing that these online communities can bring, the damage these online communities can do is that they take away the humanity of conversation and they just strip it down to the exchange of data. And we're really bad at those kinds of conversations.
I've 100% experienced the same thing. And I've tried to, when I do get into a discussion, which some people just write those discussions online off entirely. And they just say, no, you got to sit down with somebody in person if you're really going to make a difference. And I think that is a better way to go. But I do think I've seen in my own life, there can be real changes of heart and real learning, even
definitely.
If it's not from the person you're talking with somebody else who's reading it, kind of the lurkers online. I all the time have people who haven't seen in a while, and they're like, hey, I really appreciate the discussions that you have on Instagram or on your Facebook page or on Twitter. And something that I've learned is because tone, when you're disagreeing with somebody in a comm box, tends to come across as harsher than you intend, I try to be like effervescently positive. Oh, thank you so much for sharing your opinion with me. I really respect what you have to say. Here now I'm gonna like give my rebuttal. So try to be above reproach. I actually, who I think is really good at this most of the time is Stephen Colbert, who of course is Catholic, and it is kind of what I think a lot of people would say is kind of a liberal, progressive, quote unquote cafeteria Catholic. I think he's pro-choice. He's friends with Father James Martin, and he spent most of his career criticizing conservatives. But when you hear him talk about his faith, it's like, this guy knows Jesus and this guy knows the church and he loves the church and he loves God and his people. There's, when he was growing up, I think his dad and like two of his brothers died when he was like 10 or something like that. And there was an interview with Anderson Cooper. You can Google it. And he has Anderson Cooper like in tears by sharing. I wrote the quote down here. He said, this is Stephen Colbert. He says, what punishments of God are not gifts? What punishments of God are not gifts? And I'm like, ooh, have you ever heard like a more Mother Teresa Catholic quote from a public person? And Anderson Cooper's like, what do you mean? And he says something to the extent of, it's a gift to exist, and to exist in this world is to suffer. And I'm grateful for the things I've learned because I have a quote here. He says, you get awareness of other people's loss, which allows you to connect with that other person, which allows you to love more deeply and understand what it's like. You get awareness of to understand what it's like to be a human being. So, and then he had Andrew Garfield on when Andrew Garfield did that movie on, it's called like Silence. It's about the Jesuit missionaries that go to Japan. And Andrew Garfield and Kylo Ren, I'm forgetting the actor's name from Star Wars. But anyway, the guy, Adam Driver, so Adam Driver and Andrew Garfield, they did like the Jesuit Ignatian spiritual exercises, which are like these deep meditations that St. Ignatius came up with like in the 15th century. And Father James Martin actually gave them like a mini version of the exercises to go through. And like that conversation between Andrew Garfield who's not a Christian, but did these exercises and talking with Stephen Colbert. It's like these guys are talking about meditation and like suffering in their lives and like redemptive suffering. And like you can see a real just vulnerability there, I think, in Stephen Colbert, and a real authentic search for truth, even though if he and I sat down, it was definitely some things he and I would disagree on. And I think he's way off the mark on some things. But at the same time, like he's like, you can tell he knows Jesus, you know, there's some parts of his life that maybe that hasn't penetrated, but the same is true for me, you know, like I'm sure I have spiritual blind spots in my own way. I'm probably a cafeteria Catholic in some ways I don't understand and won't understand until the final judgment when God's like, this not so good, you know? So I try to have some humility about that.
Yeah, that's another huge thing from the gospel that I don't think we take seriously, is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and everyone's sins are bad. And the tax collector and the Pharisee, right? I don't think Catholics who are good Catholics, I don't think we take that into consideration often enough, is that, because you've been given much will be expected of you. And so, the guy who has been, the gospel's been misrepresented to him, and he's living a life of sin and a life of degeneracy, than you and me, because we have been given so much grace in our lives, and we know so deeply the gospel, and we are surrounded by good, holy, and orthodox people, that God's like, and yet you still did XYZ, and yet you knew this was wrong, and yet you still did this. Why did you do this? The sin is harsher.
Yeah.
That's why I know. That's why the saints are like, I am the foremost among sinners. St. Paul said that, and I don't think he was just BSing. I think he was serious. He's like, no, I am the foremost among sinners because I have ascended to the third heaven, and yet I still have this thorn in my flesh. I still do this sin, and I should know better, and I don't. And I beg God to show mercy. And like at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's like, you have fallen so short of the glory of God, and yet you throw yourself on God's mercy. And that's, everyone who does that makes to the finish line. So you can like try and work your way there, which you're not going to be able to do, because the more you know, the more of the more you do, the more is expected of you. Just throw yourself on God's mercy, and that's it. And just hope that the XYZ liberal conservative that is not going to go to heaven in your eyes does the same thing. That's my thoughts about that.
Like what you're talking about right now, like keeps me up at night sometimes. And it's like the most terrifying part of the gospel where Jesus is like, to whom much is given, much is expected. There are many, this is at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, he says, there are many at the end who will say, Lord, did we not do mighty works in your name? And he's like, I don't know you. I feel like that's speaking to me, because my neuroses and my vices and like the corruption of my heart looks very virtuous on the outside. Like if I let myself go to like my weakest parts and my deepest, darkest demons, I don't get angry. I get people pleasy, right? So on the exterior, when I'm at my most insecure, most selfish, I am serving people because I'm trying to get you to like me. I'm trying to get you to think that I'm the greatest guy ever. I'm like that Taylor Swift song Mastermind. Like I'm working it all together so that you think I'm super awesome and you think I'm super funny and nice, but really inside, it's like all self-serving. And so, like, and if those weren't my, like, so I'm really not that holy, and I had this realization at one point, like, oh, I'm not holy. I'm just like really, really like manipulative in a way that's pleasing to the world. I'm really good at like figuring out what people want. Like I can be kind of like a charismatic schmoozer,
I found the sins that are palatable to people,
yes,
like
exactly. And that is just as damning.
Yeah.
I'm the tax collector on the corner who's doing all the tithes and all the fasting and thinking, aren't I so glad that I'm not like that tax collector over there who's so sinful, and I'm righteous before God. And even I find in my mind, because I work in ministry, because I went to Catholic U, because I have all these awesome priest friends and I run a Catholic podcast and I lead music at my church, that like when somebody tells me they're Catholic, in my mind, I'm like, oh, but they're really Catholic. Are they a solid Catholic? Are they like, I really have to guard against that. Yeah.
We had a guy come into our Discord and pretend to be, a very liberal, he said he was divorced 5 times, said he had like a gay daughter or whatever. And he was lying, basically. And he was trying to test our Discord community to see if we were really Orthodox. And in doing so, he was lying, right? And so it's kind of like, it's all about what sins are you okay with? What sins do you find acceptable? And then I really think this is the big clencher with infotainment, is that conservatives and liberals, they both have sins that they find to be more acceptable or more okay. And their Catholics on both sides are very good at pointing out, hey, that's a sin. There was a thing on Twitter the other day about money sins and pants sins, right? Like wallet sins and pants sins. It's like the left is not okay with the wallet sins, but is okay with the pants sins. And then the right is not okay with the pants sins, but is okay with the wallet sins. And both sides are very comfortable pointing out the hypocrisy of the other.
Yeah.
You know, the right is very comfortable pointing out that it's hypocritical that the left wants this is a really controversial example, but that the left wants forced vaccinations and the right doesn't want forced birth, but the right wants the opposite, right? They're both very good at pointing out each other's hypocrisy, but they don't recognize their own. That's because that's how every human being is. We are it's very easy for us to recognize other people's hypocrisy and not our own. And that's the beauty of the Pharisee tax collector dynamic, is that call someone a Pharisee, you have become the Pharisee in the Pharisee and the tax
Big old
collector
plank
parable.
sticking out of your eye.
It's if you ever find yourself in like, thank God I'm not like the Pharisee back there, and the Pharisee's back there like, Lord Jesus, have mercy on me, a sinner. You know, it's like, it's so funny that the parable is just such a mirror to humanity, because it's like, if you ever find yourself pointing at the other side and saying you are wrong, you are a hypocrite, it's like there's four fingers sticking right back at you, buddy. Like, we're all here, we're all hypocrites, and like we all need God's mercy. And so that's what it means to love your enemy, is instead of pointing out their hypocrisy, it's loving them and accepting them where they are, starting at the St. Christopher medal and working your way up to the other things. Yeah.
And that's so much what I love about Jesus. Like, anytime I have doubts in my faith, when I feel alone in the world and I find myself wondering, like, is this all made up? You know, is this all fake? Have I committed myself to it? I have those doubts every once in a while. I know lots of people do. I always come back to Jesus and I'm like, man, Jesus is awesome. And like, he handled these situations so well in a way where, you know, somebody would ask him a gotcha question. You know, this is the sort of question you would get at a political debate where they're saying, no, answer the question. What is a woman? You know, answer the question. There's, you know, different political people have these different kind of gotcha questions. You know, should women who've had abortions go to jail? What should be their punishment? They try to nail you into these really tight little things where no matter what you say, it's going to be wrong. And they try to do that with Jesus too. Like, should we pay the tax to Caesar? You know, what should we do with this woman who's caught in adultery? And Jesus is like, let me tell you about this widow. You know, let me tell you this story. And he totally disarms this situation by helping people to see outside of this binary they created. Like, look, this woman was caught in adultery. Absolutely should not be sinning, but we're also not going to throw rocks at her till she's dead. You know, like, the Romans, absolutely, they are oppressive. They're treating us in a bad way, but like, also pay your taxes. You know? Like, he's able to walk this third way where he's like, there's something to be seen on both sides here, and we can embrace all of that. And that's one of the things I love about the Catholic intellectual tradition, is it's able to tackle the world with a little more nuance. You were talking before about, and I love this, I'd never heard of this before, but it made sense once you said it, the wallet sins and the pants sins. And I think something that I've learned from Catholic theology of John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis is the wallet sins and the pants sins are actually very much related. When we talk, St. Pope Francis talks about like the throwaway culture. It's very similar to John Paul II's idea of a culture of death. That encompasses sleeping with your boyfriend and girlfriend in high school, looking at pornography, divorce, contraception, but also like the damaging parts of capitalism and socialism and exploiting workers. Like, all of that is related because it all has to do with the family. It all has to do with human flourishing. It all has to do with how we treat each other. And like, the pants sins and the wallet sins, like, your wallet is in your pants most of the time. Like, those are connected. They're not as different as we think. You know what I mean?
That's great.
And that's something I love about being Catholic, is it gives us that more comprehensive, holistic, more nuanced view. So.
Yeah, and that kind of the nuance, it brings it back to this infotainment thing. I think infotainment is great when it can provide that nuance, when it gives a fair. I think there's a way to be an entertaining informer and an entertaining educator. I think there's a way to do that. I think there's a way to kind of balance the line of like, these kinds of statements do good on the algorithm and they're also true, because that's what it comes down to now, right? It's like, it's not TV ratings, it's how can we get eyeballs on Instagram Reels. And so I think there's a way to work that balance of, you know, this is true and it's engaging and there is nuance here. I think we as entertainers and informers, educators, can be a little more nuanced with our approaches, especially in the way that we deal with people in the comments section. I think that's one place I try to engage in nuance. It's hard to engage in nuance in a tweet. It's hard to do nuance in a reel. It's easier to do it in the follow-up discussions or just in private conversations. But I think
because it's so one-sided a lot of times.
Oh,
It's,
yeah.
you're in a reel, you're just talking to an imaginary person, or it's all your side
Yeah.
of the conversation. You
Oh,
know, and you
yeah.
get to say a 5-minute thing in response to a one-line tweet. So
Yeah, my best reels and my best tweets are when I do the proposal from the other side. So Mary is praying the rosary is vain repetition. I'll say that, and that hooks people that agree and disagree, because it makes the people who disagree mad, and it makes people who agree interested. And then I follow it up with like a snappy comeback, and that does the opposite. So it's a very good formula. If you want to steal it, please do. But the part that's difficult from like an ethical perspective is like, is that initial proposition something that someone actually says? You know?
Yeah.
I never want it to be a straw man. I never want it to be something that's fake, because it needs to be true. Otherwise, it's perpetuating falsehood. It's perpetuating bad discussions. And so because that example, praying to Mary is vain repetition, is something that people say all the time, I can follow it up with, well, then what is the bridge to oceans then? It's also repetition. You know, and then we can have a discussion of, okay, what is repetition wrong, or is it just vain repetition that's wrong? Right.
Yeah.
We can have that conversation.
Yeah. Do not be like the pagans who think they will be heard because they're many words. And I think there can be a temptation in Catholicism for that, because we have these novenas and stuff. And sometimes we think, you know, if I just figure out the right novena to pray, and I wear the right scapular, and I do the right devotion, then God will give me what I want. And then we're kind of thinking in pagan terms of, I have to like solve the formula of what God wants to give me what I want. I need to sacrifice X amount of grain or X animal to the rain god to get a good harvest. Like, and I think that's what Jesus is talking about, is like, look, I came here as God, as God's son, to sacrifice myself for you. And yeah, that's going to require some sacrifice from you as well. But it's not this bartering system that you had with these impersonal, like superhero gods of Zeus and Thor and Osiris, like sword of God, you know? And that's the whole thing with Abraham taking Isaac up the mountain is, you know, yes, we as followers of the one God, we are willing to give everything to God, but our God is not that sort of God where you need to bargain and barter and beg for his attention and his love by sacrificing your children or whatever. Like, no, he sacrifices himself from us and draws us into relationship with him as a loving father. And then, yes, we have to sacrifice in conforming ourselves to his will, but it's not as some distant tyrant God who you got to get his attention by some amazing sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly.
It's this step by step. So, and that can happen just as well with the Bridge of Oceans. You know, am I really praying this song with the heart of worship? You know, am I praying it in the right way? Am I reading the right Bible verse, or am I praying the right Hail Mary? Like,
am I raising my hands
with a spirit of surrender? Am I raising my hands? It needs to come with a spirit of surrender to God and trust in him. So
Absolutely.
What you were saying before is like proposing that question, and almost even like maybe even a false question. Like, nobody maybe really said this, but it's a good idea to debunk. I feel like Jesus does that too, when he's like, you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Maybe he heard somebody say that, maybe he didn't, but it's good for him. That's kind of something we think in our hearts, you know, without articulating it. So it's good for him to debunk it. So I think that's a very Jesus approach.
It's a good formula.
Yeah, it's a good formula. I wanted to ask you, what are some other names in the infotainment world that you think are doing it well or not doing it well? Who can we learn from, either a positive example or a negative example of when they're doing this infotainment thing well? Can you think of any of those?
Yeah, right off the bat, I do think Bishop Barron is a good example. He's very level-headed. He's a little too out of reach for the common man, I think, which is why he has other personalities. That kind of work underneath him. I think from a secular perspective, not necessarily secular, I think Dave Ramsey just has killed it with information and entertainment. Like, he understands personality-driven education. He's the only speaker I know who has successfully hired other speakers to be like underneath him as his minions. He has like his Ramsey personalities, right? And they all have their own specialty. He's kind of crafted this like expert brand. He's kind of crafted his expertise around brand and branding education. So I think he does it really well. His people are entertaining.
He's like the financial planning guy and investing.
Oh yeah,
right?
Dave Ramsey's a financial planning guy. He's like a personal finance. He started like 30 years ago just doing a course that he taught, and now I think he's worth like $300 million or something. He's like crazy. He's got this crazy.
It's working for him.
Yeah, and he's no debt too. He like owns all of his buildings. It's really funny. But he's got
like that idea that debt snowball that you like pay off the one debt,
Yeah.
but then once you paid off the one thing, you switch the money you were paying to that to the next thing so you can pay off all your debt.
Yeah, and he's got this
used
radio
a couple of
show.
his ideas.
He's got this radio show that he's been running for years. It's the number 3 radio show in the country, and it's an independent syndicated show. It's not like associated with a network. And so, yeah, I think he does it the best. And I think he does it because he's very entertaining. He makes jokes. He communicates with the audience. He, brings people in and he celebrates with them, right? I think he's a really great example of infotainment and that like education perspective. I think it's hard to be if I tell you here's a political infotainment person, it's immediately going to like silo me into
trigger people.
Like, I think
Uh-huh.
I think Matt Walsh is doing a great job. Oh, you think Matt Walsh is good? He's a conservative alt-right nut job with the infotainment space as it stands.
Yeah.
I think
I
old
think
Ben
Matt Walsh
Shapiro
is
was
hilarious.
good.
Yeah.
I like 22 Ben Shapiro before he started working out. Like a skinny little boy who's very good at debating and has a high-pitched voice. I think he was amazing. Steven Crowder before he started cross-dressing and taking off his clothes. He needs to keep male clothes on, Steven Crowder does. He needs to keep his clothes on, and they should be pants, in my opinion. And then I think infotainment guys, anybody who, let me go the other way. I don't know if Colbert's good anymore. I know he was really good on the Colbert Report, but that was pretty, I'll say Colbert Report. I'll throw Colbert in there. I think he was pretty good at infotainment.
Yeah, I really like Colbert. I like Matt Walsh, not because I always agree with him. I just think he's hilarious. I think he's really, really funny. He's like, I think he could do stand-up, and it's a different sort of humor. I read an article one time about like what liberals find funny and what conservatives find funny, and one of the things that it said conservatives tend to find more funny is like the exaggeration and like just going to extremes. And I think that's a lot of why Trump is been very successful, is because he is, he says, get that guy out of here, throw him out,
turn those lights off, turn those.
Yeah, like he just says everything to extremes.
Yeah,
and it's say what you want about Trump, he's really funny, and I think Matt Walsh is kind of the same way.
Objectively funniest president. You can't argue that.
Yeah. Objectively funny.
Liberals think words are funny, like really long sentences. They have Democratic. This is like a big joke on Twitter, is that leftist memes are just like paragraphs of text, and it's like, I am not reading that. That's not about like the working class and that's rooted in deep-seated indigenous whatever. It's like it's very long. That's fun. We gotta have fun. We gotta laugh at each other. We're all big one happy family. No one's taking up arms anymore. We're all hopefully.
Yeah, and laugh at ourselves too. I think.
Come on.
Let's
be goofy.
I wanted to talk about kind of classical rhetoric. This is maybe something listeners you studied in high school or college at some point. So it comes from the Greeks, kind of the theory of how to persuade people well. And there's this ethos, this pathos, and this logos. And I think a lot of that is kind of undergirding what we're talking about here. Kind of, do you trust the person? And you can see this in political discourse where Joe Biden's will be like, I was talking to Sally Mae down in Kansas and she doesn't have enough money to run her farm anymore, and so that makes you feel like, oh, he understands the plights of workers and he knows us, like that ethos. I think Obama was like amazing at this. Like, agree or disagree with Obama, he's super likable, and like he's just a super likable guy. I think he had this ethos down. Bill Clinton is the same sort of way, just kind of a charmer. And then pathos is the emotional argument. So when you're talking about poverty, you talk about how hard it is for working class people, and I think music can a lot of times play into the pathos. Whatever song you choose as your intro music, or what you're going to play at the Democratic National Convention or the Republican National Convention. And then there's logos, which is kind of the meat and potatoes behind it, is the intellectual, rational grounding. And I had a professor once say that when you have a really solid argument, you have that ethos so that people trust you. You have the pathos so it hits them in the heart, and the logos so it's like the meat and potatoes that actually make sense. But a lot of times what you get is just the ethos and the pathos. And he said, you know what you call that? You call that propaganda. And I was like,
oh yeah, you call it BS.
When you trust someone and they have a really compelling emotional argument, but it doesn't make sense when you think about it, that's propaganda. And I think about that all the time. When somebody is telling you how to feel about something, that like red flag propaganda.
Oh yeah. Because feelings and anxiety are not reflections of reality. And human beings are really good at tricking ourselves into thinking that I feel X, therefore Y is true. And that's just not how things work. And yeah, I think that's part of the second threshold with infotainment, as it moves past what it was, where it's a funny way to understand the logos. It's like a good way to package the truth, whereas you just take the truth out. And there's a reason why the core of the faith, why the word of God, John called it the logos, because, all truth is Jesus. Jesus is truth, And so when you remove truth from the conversation, when you only have that ethos and pathos and you have no logos, you have no truth, you have no Jesus, there's no Christ here. And so it's a very anti-Christ. I don't want to say that as a little harsh. It's anti-Christian, it's missing something that's at the core. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Like the logos is the real foundation on which ethos and pathos have to be built. And Jesus did have the ethos and the pathos. I think that's part of why God came down and took on flesh as one of us. So it wasn't just this word from on high. It was the word with us, God with us. He suffered like us. He understands what it's like to be with us. He sat with us. He wasn't rich. He was poor. He went through everything all of us go through. And so we can trust him. He's got that emotional argument. He's got ethos, that trust, and he not only has the logos, he is the logos, So, and Saint Augustine, who early saint of the church, who was very educated in all this Greek philosophy stuff, what he said, there's like three parts of the soul, and he gets this from Plato and Aristotle. There's like the irrational passions, and that's like the pathos. And then there's this part of the soul that seeks honor and like relationship with other people. And then there's this rational part of the soul that seeks truth, goodness, and beauty. And he says, when our soul is disordered, when we seek ethos or pathos, when we seek the emotions and the pleasure and the approval of other people, the life of gratification or the life of honor over truth and over dedication to truth, goodness, and beauty, that's when we end up enslaved to honor.
Yeah.
That's when we end up enslaved to the opinions of other people, enslaved to our passions. And St. Augustine says that's what original sin is. He calls it, the fancy word he uses is concupiscence. He says this is one of the effects of original sin, is that we go through life chasing after the pleasure and the emotions and the approval without the truth behind it. And what baptism does for us, what sanctification and the sacraments and all of the life of the church and prayer does for us, is it realigns our soul and reorders our soul so that the things we love are in the right order, right? We love the most important things most and the less important things less, right? We love our family over cheeseburgers. We love God over the opinions of other people. And we love goodness and truth and justice more than being liked. And when those things, the things we love get out of order, that is like the definition of sin. And it's, what we struggle against every day. I want to pull this in for a landing here, Patrick. I've loved this conversation, and I've loved what we've talked about here. Any other infotainment people that you just think it would be a crime if we did not mention them and the good things that we're doing? Anything else we got to hit before we close this down?
John Oliver. I think John Oliver does an incredible job at describing and packaging complex issues. I think his approach, a lot of people don't like him.
Yeah, I do
like him.
That's fine.
I think he gets a lot wrong, but his main story segment on Last Week Tonight is solid. You can tell that he's got journalistic people involved. He gets the facts correct, and he throws in some jokes. I think he's a very funny guy, personally.
Right, maybe I'll have to give him another chance.
You know what?
I do like accents.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll give him a second chance.
I do like John Oliver. I a lot of the stuff he's done recently. I stopped watching him before. I watched him a little bit before COVID, and then after COVID, I stopped watching him. So I don't know what has happened in the last 3 years. I'm certain it's not been great. I'm certain he hopped right on the... I'm certain he towed the party line. I know that's definitely true. But a lot of the deep dives that he did on things like he did a deep dive on mobile homes and just how unfair the system is and how exploitative the industry can be and ways that people can get around it. I was like, this is fascinating. I'm never going to use this, but it was just so fascinating. And so that's John Oliver. I think he's a well-known and solid infotainment guy. At least he was 3 years ago. I don't know. I stopped watching him when he was alone in his room because there was no one laughing at his jokes. And I was like, how am I supposed to know if it's funny or not if no one's laughing with me? Not a John Oliver fan, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've never looked into him that much, but what I have seen him, not so much. But I definitely will give him I trust your judgment, so I'll give him a second chance. I have two more questions for you to close this out. One, we are in an election year, and election years are really stressful sometimes because everyone's opinions come out, and it's been crazy, and it's probably going to be Trump and Biden again. People, as a wholly well-balanced, rational Catholic people trust you. You're a trusted voice in America. What's your advice for people to stay wholly insane through the next year?
My advice for people to stay wholly insane during this election year would probably just be don't vote. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. I'm just kidding. I think that, avoid the trap of stay informed. I think it's just go on campaign websites, read their positions, and that's it. That's all you need. Because that's the stuff that they've put forward. It is completely biased in their favor. So you know you're getting BS'd, which is helpful. And then go read the other guy and then choose and pick. And there's no I think one thing that we need to all recognize is that we have no idea what it takes to run a country. Oh, I don't like how Biden made this decision. Oh, I don't like how Trump handled unemployment. We don't know. I don't know how, I don't know how to handle unemployment for a country of 3 million people. All I know is I don't like babies getting killed. That's a huge one. I don't like other people getting killed in general.
Yeah.
I think taxes should be lower. I don't think we should be sending so much overseas. Like that. Those are my opinions. Just look at the campaign website, see what they think. And then, if you like Matt Walsh, you like John Oliver, watch their show, have fun. Let it influence you, whatever. But just when it comes to the ballot box, campaign websites are just the only thing you should really take into consideration.
Nice.
Maybe that's naive of me.
Last question. Last question I have for you. I told my guests at the beginning that we would have some practical advice for how they can live this message of Jesus' radical love and the gospel in their life. So thinking back over everything we've talked about today, what is your takeaway? What's one thing you're walking away from this conversation with on your heart?
I think every person should work to establish a switch in their head that flips when they notice them accusing someone else of hypocrisy. I think if we all had this little governor in our brain that goes, that person's a hypocrite. Hold on, wait a second. We're all hypocrites. Maybe I should think about my own hypocrisy in this situation, right? Just an automatic knee-jerk reaction of, I'm not going to call someone a hypocrite. Every time I want to call someone a hypocrite, I'm going to look back at myself, because that's the point of the gospel, is that we are all flawed and we are all self-contradictory. And so whenever you notice it in someone else, now's a good time to see, where is that hypocrisy in me, so that you can become more consistent and more like Jesus. That's my main takeaway.
Amen. Yeah, I love that. But to examine the plank in your eye before you take the splinter out of the other person's eye.
Exactly.
To you, the splinter in their eye might look like a plank, and the splinter in your eye might just seem like an eyelash or something. Or the plank in your eye might seem like an eyelash or something. For me, I think something that I'm thinking about this election year and just over everything we've talked about is is peace. The idea of peace, and to if we want peace in our world, like that starts from within, and to not neglect prayer. I saw a meme the other day where somebody said, watching Catholic influencers on YouTube is not a spiritual life. Prayer is a spiritual life. And so taking these things to prayer, what does it say our Blessed Mother did in the Gospel of Luke? It says when she was overwhelmed, it says she took all these things and she contemplated them in her heart. And so I'm going to try to have the attitude of our Mother Mary this year is I'm going to take all these things and I'm going to contemplate them in my heart with trust in the Lord and rest in his peace, and know that whatever happens, really it's all under his providence. It's all in his plan. Yes, we're responsible. Yes, we have something we can do to address in this world, but really it's all on him. And so that's going to be my takeaway walking forward from this. Patrick, would you close us in for me and our listeners? Would you help us pray this out and just help us to cover everything we've talked about in prayer?
Yeah, of course. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Holy Spirit. Amen.
Lord Jesus, you commanded us not to worry. You said that no one has ever added a day to their life by worrying. I ask that as we are faced with uncertainty in the world, and as the news and the internet pushes the cares of the current events on us, I ask that you give us the peace that surpasses understanding to take those current events, pray about them, and give them back to you. I ask that you keep our anxieties low and keep our peace high as only you can. In Jesus' name, amen. Father,
amen.
Son, Holy Spirit.
Father, Son,
Amen.
Holy Spirit. Amen. Patrick, thank you so much. And if people want to know more about you, want to know more about the Crunch or your Discord or the dating stuff you're doing on the Crunch, I should say the dating content you're creating, not the dating stuff, because I know you're married.
Yeah, we're married.
But where can people go to find more?
Yeah, we're the Crunchcast everywhere. That's on Instagram or on Twitter. That's the best place to find us. You can go to the Crunchcast. Our Discord is bit.com/Crunch Discord. But honestly, if you're like, I need to find more about these guys, just follow us on Instagram at the Crunchcast. Everything else you can find from there, the Discord, the podcast, etc. So at the Crunchcast on Instagram.
Anything else you want to plug or tell us about? Exciting things you got coming up?
No. One call to action only, Mike.
All right. Very good.
That's best practices.
Awesome.
Crunchcast on Instagram.
Listeners, thank you so much for going on this journey with us. If you have opinions about anything we said, you can leave that in the comments or send us a message on Instagram or Twitter, wherever it is that you do your online commentary, with charity, of course. And if you appreciated the show, if you learned something from it, I would encourage you to share this episode with someone. Just send them a screenshot, send it to them in their DMs or something like that. If say, hey, I think you'd really like this. And if you are one of our like super fans, if you listen to every episode of Pop Culture Catechism, you've been listening to us for a while, and this is just your favorite show or one of your favorite shows, I would invite you to become a patron by going to popculturecatechism.com and choosing to support us on a monthly basis. There's 6 giving levels, all of which come with perks, and you get exclusive content and all sorts of stuff. Feed my babies. So I want to give a special thank you to all of our listeners, all of our patrons, but especially Carl and Melissa Gore, Lisa and Bob Tenney, Stephen, Maggie Hubbard, and Tom and Emily Kumberi Adi. Thank you to all of you for listening, for pressing play today, and for staying with us through the end. God loves you. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.
Do you love the message that you just heard? Do you wish you could share it with the people of your community, church, or school in an effective and compassionate way? Did you know that Awaken Catholic speakers and musicians can come to you for an event? Now, don't get me wrong, I love online messages and they can be great, but I think we all know that most of the time the way that hearts and minds are changed is in person. So if your community could use some revival, go to awakencatholic.org or send it to your ministry staff, and we would love to come meet you, to pray with you, and to help your community experience the love of God in a deeper way.